I write about religion and cults and politics in times of crisis, and I've got something from the good news department to share today. This is David Inczauskis.
We came out in great strength in numbers today. Catholics from all around Chicagoland have come out to support our sisters and brothers detained here.
So David's a Jesuit priest in Chicago. He's one of the many clergy of many denominations protesting with congregants at ICE facilities. And he's going to be my guest on the podcast coming up soon. Now, in this protest, he was part of a Catholic contingent who planned out the nonviolent direct action of bringing communion to ICE detainees, many of whom are Latin American Catholics, and they're doing another event like this on Saturday. I want to point out a subtext here that I think is actually a big story. It's about a popular resurgence of interest in liberation theology, and it links David and his comrades all the way to Leo in Rome. So I'll get to that. So bringing the ritual bread and wine to prisoners goes way back to the story of the very young Saint Tarcisius, who was murdered by a mob of Roman youth for attempting to deliver communion to imprisoned Christians. Now, I was raised Catholic with that story. I would describe myself now as being too leftist to still belong, but I am Francis and Leo curious. So that's just to say that I'm not blowing smoke with my take on what they are doing here from their point of view. So firstly, they're taking the church to the place of struggle. The church in this philosophy is not a building or altar, it is acts of service and love. Also, they are connecting the body of Jesus to the bodies of the incarcerated and to their own bodies. And they're using a symbol of metaphysical transformation to make a direct materialist intervention. They're not just carrying the communion, they are embodying it and the life it represents, but also the death too, because there's a chance they'll be shot. So David and his friends, these are women and men in religious orders, and the congregants that came with them, are taking a stand. And in this story, they join a long line of American religious who have stood up to fascism for over a century. But there's an important difference, though, now, and that's part of this larger story. In the past, in addition to at times shamefully appeasing or even backing fascist regimes, the broader Catholic Church has often undermined its justice-oriented clergy, or at best offered arm's-length tolerance of their activism. Ground zero for this conflict in the 20th century has been the vitality and status of liberation theology in Latin America through figures like Peruvian Gustavo Gutiérrez, who was kept on a tight leash by church elites because liberation theology makes use of a Marxist analysis of capitalism. Liberation theology basically says that God speaks through the poor and that there's no difference between serving the poor or the sick or the incarcerated or the migrant or the unhoused person and serving God. Now, this was not an unknown idea in 20th century Catholicism, but in liberation theology, it becomes the bottom line, often by focusing on the unhoused migrant status of Jesus himself. Now, in 1984, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, but forever a technocrat of dogma, wrote a big old letter admonishing Gutierrez and other liberation theologian upstarts for uncritically accepting things like historical materialism, because that didn't account for things like miracles or grace. Ratzinger and many others also weren't crazy about class struggle language, because of course churches are where both rich and poor can gather together under the same creed, but that kind of gets weird if you really think about it. More crucially, Ratzinger implied that liberation theology endorsed revolutionary violence. Now, that's not true. The farthest someone like Gutierrez would go would be to write in 1971, "The political arena is necessarily conflictual. The building of a just society means the confrontation in which different kinds of violence are present between groups with different interests and opinions." How dare he observe reality like that? Now, just a side note here, it wasn't just the conservative church that was interested in undermining liberation theology. It was also the CIA. So I've got some episodes on that coming out on Conspirituality Podcast this coming weekend. But to be fair, the conservative church did have reason to be queasy, because there were liberation theology priests who went in radical directions, like Camilo Torres Restrepo. He's a Colombian Jesuit who went to school with Gutierrez in Belgium, actually, but took a very different path, irritating his superiors in Bogota to the point that he was booted out of the priesthood altogether. And he took that opportunity to become an early member of and chaplain for the now notorious National Liberation Army. And he died in combat against Colombian forces at the age of 37 in his first combat experience. But for the most part, liberation theology guys have walked a careful, nonviolent line as they support communities seeking structural change. And the fact that they walked that line might be part of the reason why this guy, Robert Prevost, originally of Chicago, but with decades of service in Gutierrez's home country of Peru, is now out there able to quote liberation theology with his full chest in a document that speaks indirectly but also pointedly at Trumpian fascism and also at the capitalist system that produced him. So in his first major letter to the world's 1.8 billion Catholics, De Lex Aetate, on the love of the poor, Leo spends about 20% of the text directly quoting and elaborating on liberation theology, politely dismissing Ratzinger's prior warnings and striking out at capitalism itself, the, quote, dictatorship of an economy that kills, and he condemns ideologies that, quote, defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation, and that, quote, reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control, unquote. Now, if that's not a direct enough attack on Trumpian politics, he also lays into the abject cruelty of anti-immigrant politics, saying that the church knows, or should know, that it is Christ himself who knocks at the door of the community as a migrant. So why zoom out so far? What does this have to do with bringing communion to an ICE facility? Because David Inczauskis is one of the most visible millennial proponents of liberation theology in the US now, with a social media presence and an excellent podcast about liberation theology. Like Leo, David spent formative years in South America, bearing witness to the destructive nature of US-led global capitalism.
Sure. We were denied our fundamental human right given by God, which is to worship, and those who are inside have been denied that right. And so we leave today angry, but we also leave motivated, and we know that we have a lot of organizing work to do to address the situation here today that we can really only describe as evil.
So you know that imperial boomerang idea where fascism is seen as the blowback of colonialism onto European populations? Well, with liberation theology, I think there's another boomerang in play. European Marxism finding an organic expression in Latin America and then spinning back to Chicago and even Rome to build a moral and political case against global fascism. So we'll see how it plays out. But I wouldn't be surprised if this type of Catholicism presents a real problem for Trump.